This is a true story that involves my firstborn son. He was in second grade at the time, and we were living in Tacoma, Washington. It's been 27 years since this occurred, but it still haunts me to this day. A little backstory to put these events into perspective. It was January of 1995. My son, up to this point, had been walking to and from his bus stop, which was a block and a half away from our house, located at the bottom of a steep hill. He would have to walk down in the mornings and up in the afternoons. There was an elderly man from Korea who lived across the street from us, who had been brutally murdered, which is an unrelated incident, but needless to say, tensions were high in our neighborhood around this time. We lived in a small complex with 4 houses, each one having their own fenced-in yard, and there was an entry gate that enclosed everything. My son used to take a shortcut through an alleyway that ran behind the houses to get to his bus stop. He had done it so many times before that it became normal, and there wasn't a worry in the world as to our son's safety, until the day in question. That day started out like any other. I woke up at around 6 to get the kids ready for school. Our second eldest was the first one to leave. He was in special ed and had to be bused across the city. Then our eldest son left the house. I watched him as he walked through the complex, then out the gate, and disappeared down the alleyway. Fast forward to the afternoon. I knew that my eldest son would be coming home soon. I was busy in the house tending to chores when I heard a frantic knocking at my door. I opened it and saw through the screen door that it was my next-door neighbor. She had a terrified look on her face. "Hey, what's wrong?" She then told me that she saw someone trying to lure my son into their car. I immediately screamed for my husband, and we both ran out of the house. And to our horror, there was someone in a white sedan reaching through the driver's side window of the car, pulling my son by his shirt. If you aren't a parent, you can't imagine how terrifying this was to witness. I went ballistic while my husband ran towards the car screaming, "Get the fuck away from my son!" Our son managed to pull away from the driver and quickly backed against the perimeter fence. I saw that every time he went to move, the vehicle kept moving to prevent him from escaping. At this point, the neighbors that lived across the alley, who were friends with my husband, heard all the commotion, and they leapt over their fence, and one sprinted to the front of the sedan while the other swept up our son into his arms and quickly brought him over to us. The assailant just sat in his car, stone silent, not moving at all. I remember staring into his soulless eyes. I had never seen so much emptiness in my life. It sent shivers down my backside. It was like looking into the eyes of the devil himself. The driver actually sat there long enough that we were able to get a complete physical description of him, the vehicle, and his license plate information. My next-door neighbor called the police, but of course, by the time they got there, the man had already left the scene. It still freaks me out to think about what would have happened to our son if my next-door neighbor hadn't seen what she saw that day. We might have never seen our son again. Another thing that upsets me is that right before the man took off, he pulled out one of those old Polaroid cameras and took a couple of pictures of my son. That really got under my skin. When a police officer finally came, he looked like he was fresh out of high school. I remember him eyeing me skeptically and said that I was just being a hysterical mom. Like, what the fuck? Is that what you tell someone who just saw their son almost get kidnapped? My advice to all police is that you don't send a rookie to investigate a child abduction case, and also, don't hire fucking morons. This incident has scarred me for life, and for the longest time, I wouldn't let our son out of my sight, and I made him hold my hand everywhere we went. I went to extremes to protect my other children as well. So if you think that nothing bad can ever happen to you, please think again and take caution. To end things on a happy note, my son is now 35, happily married, and is a successful auto mechanic with his own shop. God bless you all, and stay safe. This story took place in July of 2020 in South Australia. My friends and I were all around 14 to 15 at the time. There were 7 of us in total. It was a Saturday night, and my friends and I were planning on staying the night at our friend Sean's house. The night started out relatively normal. We all just walked around the block and caused a bit of a ruckus, like teenagers do. Until around 11 p.m. We then decided to walk to the boat ramp, which was down the street from Sean's house, just to go chill out by the ocean. Now, to give some perspective, Sean's house sat almost at the end of a long street, and on the opposite end was a small turnoff that goes downhill toward the boat ramp. Houses lined one side of the path, and the other was nothing but trees and bushes. The boat ramp itself was also surrounded by thick shrubs. So we eventually made it to the boat ramp, and as we looked down the hill to where we wanted to go, we saw 2 cars parked near the water, maybe 100 yards away from us. Now at this point, we had no reason to be worried. They could have been just enjoying a late night drive for all we knew, but as teen boys, we wanted to make the situation seem as dramatic as possible. So instead of proceeding to the boat ramp, we began walking across the parking lot toward the surrounding forest, in full view of the parked cars, mind you. Now this is where I made a very stupid decision. Our group split into pairs, and I was at the very back with Josh. Most of the group had already made their way into the forest. I then motioned for Josh to stop walking. Psst, hold up, man. Check this out. I then called out to the cars. Hey assholes, we know what you're doing. Not a second later, someone from the cars shouted back at us. I'm gonna fucking cut yous! We then heard both cars start up, and soon they were both coming right for us. My heart dropped. We all began sprinting into the bushes. We probably ran for about 200 yards before stopping to catch our breath. After about another 10 minutes, we concluded that we were probably no longer being chased. They wouldn't have been able to see us from the road anyway. Just to be safe, instead of taking the path back to the road, we continued through the trees. We walked for maybe another 10 minutes before making it back to the road, and then we headed back towards Sean's house. However, we soon changed our minds and decided to walk down to the small beach across the street, since the boat ramp didn't work out. Once we were there, we just chilled out for a while. From where we were positioned on the beach, we could see the boat ramp parking lot, and the cars that were there before were now back. Now, I would like to reinforce that we were all extremely stupid and irresponsible, so what we decided to do next was just ill-advised, to say the least. We walked back up the road to the boat ramp. We were just curious about what they were doing. Was it possibly a drug deal? Or maybe it was something on the extreme side, like dumping a body into the ocean. I know it sounds ridiculous, but we were all bored and full of adrenaline. We settled that it was possibly a drug deal going down, so we thought it would be funny to yell at them again. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but we really didn't consider the danger we could have been in. We all got ready for what was about to go down. It was decided that Josh would be the one to yell at them. Once we were all ready, Josh ran to the middle of the turnoff and yelled, "Hey, are you guys doing drugs down there?" We all stood still for a few seconds, anxiously anticipating their reaction. For a second, I thought that they might not do anything, but I was wrong. The cars pulled out of their parking spots and then turned around until they were facing us. We were like deer caught in the headlights. Not a word was spoken, but we all broke into a full-on sprint as the cars began speeding towards us. Now, a few of us were running a lot faster than the others, so we were all at varying distances from the road. I look back and I'm horrified to see that one of the cars is still speeding right for us. I look to my right and see a large bush, and two of my friends dove in. In front of me is Josh, and he also disappears into a bush, so I follow. We all crouched down behind the bushes that line the road and just watched. The car slowly passes by. My heart is in my throat the entire time. Once it was out of sight, we all waited for another 5 minutes before we felt safe enough to make a run back to Sean's house. We were all pretty shaken up at that point, but there wasn't really anything that we could do about it. Technically, they didn't commit any crimes that we knew of. Looking back, I know that what we did was extremely stupid. We put ourselves into that dangerous situation, but it still unsettles me nonetheless, thinking about what could have happened if they had caught one of us. It really does make me wonder why they would have had any reason to chase a bunch of kids in the first place. Okay, so fair warning. This one is going to be long as hell. Apologies for that. But this is very hard for me, and I've been carrying this for a lot of years. On the advice of my therapist, I have written everything out to try to work out my feelings on the matter. He didn't advise me to post it online, of course, but I've struggled with this for long enough, and I need to hear other people's opinion on it. I still really have no idea how I feel about it, even after all these years, but I will submit for the judgment by the masses. I know I did wrong on some things, probably a lot of things, but I tried to do the best that I could. My son was very troubled. Very troubled. Have you ever seen a movie called We Need to Talk About Kevin? It will really help you understand what I'm talking about, because I swear to God, when I watched that film, it was like watching a documentary about my life. I felt like the writer must have had cameras hidden in my damn house. That's how accurate it was. The only difference is that in the movie, the boy appears normal to his father and only reveals his true nature to his mother. With my son, he didn't have a mask. His insane behavior was the same with everyone. My wife and I had tried to get pregnant and were ecstatic when he was born. He was wanted and loved. We showered affection on him and really tried the best we could to give him a happy childhood. But from the day we brought him home from the hospital, he was miserable. He cried for 13 months straight. I'm not exaggerating. 13 months without a break. He cried until he had no voice left, and then kept crying. You could see his little face scrunched up, and no sound coming out. Totally hoarse. There were times where he would literally cry in his sleep. I've never seen or heard any other kid be able to do that. We brought him to the doctors, specialists, tried changing his diet, held him, rocked him, toys, swaddling, music, everything we could think of, and nothing worked. 13 months of grating, grinding, no sleep, hell. Once he got over the crying stage, we thought we were out of the woods, but it quickly became clear that for some unknown reason, he was just angry to be alive. I never saw that kid have a genuine, joyous smile in all the time that I knew him. I've seen a vicious, horrible grin spread across his face many times, taking perverse pleasure in causing pain and suffering. Never once did I ever see a genuine smile on his face. Not once. He had no interest in anything positive. He was fueled by hatred, and everything he did was bent toward that. As soon as he could walk, his mission in life was to destroy things. He tried to break everything that came into his range. Smash it, chew it, throw it in the toilet, whatever he could do. After a while, he figured out how to get his diaper off and took great pleasure in shitting and pissing everywhere he could. After a while, he figured out he could hide it and started urinating and defecating in places that we wouldn't find it right away, grinding it into carpets, making it even more of a problem to clean, making the house stink. When he got older, ages 9 to 15, he would piss and shit in our bed until we got a lock on our door and he wasn't able to get in anymore. He then just took a dump in the hallway in front of our room. That biological warfare started around 2.5 years old, and he never grew out of it. I'll try to speed this up, as I could literally go on for days about this stuff. But as he grew older, he became more and more unmanageable. He would bite, kick, scream, scratch, and spit at anyone who tried to do anything with him. He was kicked out of school twice before he was 9. They let him back in, and then kicked him out for good. He had to change schools. The next one put him in a special class that kept him away from other students. We had to install a door and lock in the kitchen because he would steal knives and use them to get onto the walls and furniture or chase people with them. When he was 10, he stabbed me pretty good in the hip and ass. I still have the scars from it. As he grew older, he got darker. He moved on to setting things on fire and torturing the local animals. I will take this opportunity to preempt the tsunami of messages. Yes, we had the kid in fucking therapy. He saw a psychiatrist twice a week, and God only knows how many different medications were prescribed to him over the years. Nothing worked. Therapy didn't work. The meds did nothing. Nothing fucking worked. He was like a poison cloud of hate and fury, lashing out at anything in his reach. When my son was 16, my wife got pregnant again. I can't tell you how different our reaction was. Instead of joy, we felt horror. This pregnancy hadn't been planned, and we were really at a loss of what to do. My son had been such an unending nightmare for 16 years. We couldn't take the idea of starting again from the beginning. We talked about termination, but A, that process wasn't so easy in those days, and B, my wife is very against it. We talked about many options. In the end, we decided that my wife would have the baby, and if it turned out evil, we would put it up for adoption. We just knew we couldn't go through this again with another child like our son. We had a daughter. She was normal. Suddenly, we saw what our lives should have been like the whole time. She laughed at things, she breastfed without biting. She didn't have any teeth anyway, but you can tell she was just trying to eat, not tear her mom's breast off. After 4 months, she was sleeping through the night. She was happy, normal. I can't describe the relief and happiness we both felt. I don't have words for it. This is where I believe I may have started pulling back from my son. Up until that time, whatever mistakes I made, I'd always tried to do the best for my son. I'm convinced of that. I tried to help him, love him, and care for him. I really tried. But when my daughter was born, my wife and I both instinctively turned toward her. She became our focus, not from malice, but just because she was so much easier. She was so happy and sweet. Every moment we were with her felt like magic. I understand that this was wrong, but we honestly couldn't help it. I don't have a better explanation than that. My son hadn't given a shit about my wife being pregnant. I honestly don't know if he really understood it. But when we brought our daughter home, he started acting out even more. I didn't think it was possible, but he took it up another notch. At this time, he was around 17, and we were having full-blown shouting matches every day. Usually after we fought, he would storm out of the house and disappear for hours at a time, or come back the next morning. It was a relief. I actually started to look forward to our fights, because it would get him away from us for a while. After the birth of our daughter, my relationship with my son was almost entirely gone. Our only real interactions were screaming at each other, My wife was even worse with him. She just had nothing left. By that time, if our son came into the same room as her, she would just stop whatever she was doing and start screaming, "Get the fuck away from me. Just go away. Get the fuck out." Until he left. He started spending more and more time out of the house, which was a blessing for us. I have no idea what he got up to out in the world. We were just happy that it wasn't being inflicted on us. As a consequence of our son's behavior, we had invested heavily in locks around the house. All of the cheap, thin interior doors in our home have been replaced with thick, dense, wooden doors that could not be kicked down, equipped with locks that my wife and I carried the keys to. I know this sounds extreme, but locks and heavy doors were the best way we found to create a safe space from him. And again, before I get endowed with messages, I wasn't locking my son away in his room like some kind of prisoner. He had free reign of the house and could come and go as he pleased. My wife and I would lock ourselves in rooms to protect against him. If anything, we were prisoners in our own home. On the day in question, I fought with my son in the morning, and he left the house in a rage. My wife and I were enjoying some peace and quiet in the kitchen while our daughter napped in our bedroom. And then, my daughter began crying. Any parent who has young children can tell you, you get used to your child's cries, and you can tell after a while what they need. They cry differently when they're hungry, or if they need changing, or if they're just restless and want to be held. Babies can communicate pretty well before they speak. This cry was none of those. It was a cry of terror. The second we heard it, my wife and I both got up out of our chairs and ran to the room. The door was locked, of course, and it took a few seconds to get the right key and get it open. My son was in the room. We lived in a bungalow, and the bastard had climbed through the window to get to her. He was standing over her crib with a steak knife in his hand. I have no idea where he got it. It wasn't one of ours. We controlled our knives very carefully and always kept them in locked drawers. I think he may have taken it from one of our neighbors' houses. He had broken her skin twice already, once in the belly area and once in her arm. I could see blood. When I entered the room, he was dragging the back of the knife down her face, not cutting, almost teasing her while she screamed. He looked up at us and smiled. Before I knew what I was doing, I was already moving, running to put myself between them. I didn't think about it. I just moved instinctively. And despite this, my wife got there before I did. It was like a movie on fast forward. She got to our son and bashed his hand away, knocking the knife across the room, and then shoved him with her whole body weight. He flew away from the crib and bounced off the wall. I picked up my daughter and held her while my wife scanned us. I could see her shaking, almost convulsing. I can remember the smell of the room, the sound of my daughter screaming and wailing, the look on my son's face as he stood there. Just nothing. Blank. Dead. There was nothing in his eyes. No emotion whatsoever. He looked like an alien to me. I watched my wife take a step toward him. I could have reached out and stopped her, but I didn't. She stepped forward again, very close to him. Again, I could have stopped her, but I didn't. Now, up until this point, you may have been picturing my wife as a typical woman, small frame, dainty, delicate. This is not the case. My wife does have a small frame, but dainty and delicate she is not. Never has been since I've known her. Since her early teens, my wife has been a boxer. MMA did not exist back then, but karate and boxing were big in those days, and my wife was a very talented amateur. She was about 130 pounds and carried a lot of muscle, and she knew how to punch. I had 70 pounds on her back then, and I have no doubt that in a real fight between me and her, she would have pounded me flat. Neither of us had ever laid a hand on our son in anger before, but something broke in her that day. And all the years of anger and pain and sorrow and frustration just came pouring out. When she hit him, his head snapped back, and blood started pouring out of his nose. He hardly reacted. He just looked at her with this shocked expression, like he didn't know how to process what just happened. She waited another second, and then she hit him again. I could have reached out to stop her. I could have dragged her from the room, taken her away, calmed her down. But I didn't. I just stood there and watched while she systematically started to pound him into a pulp. Every time he brought his hands up to cover one part, she would blast him somewhere else. Body, head, body, over and over. He started screaming, crying out, yelling for her to stop. It was the most genuine reaction I had ever seen him have in his whole life. But she wasn't stopping. I watched her ramping up, hitting harder, faster, working him like a punching bag. He tried to swing at her, and she slipped him easily. She was on autopilot, sinking down into her training. I stood there, watching for a minute. I then turned my back on them and took my daughter out of the room. I brought my daughter to the kitchen and gave her a bath in the sink. I found that he had cut her a third time on the sole of her foot. All the cuts were superficial. I cleaned her up and held her until she calmed down, and then put some band-aids on her cuts. In our bedroom, I could hear my son screaming, calling my wife horrible names, telling her that he would cut her head off and sodomize her corpse. After a while, I didn't hear him say anything anymore. I didn't even hear him crying out. I assumed that he must have been knocked out, but I could still hear my wife beating him. That went on for a very long time, long enough for my daughter to drift off to sleep in my arms. I just sat at the kitchen table, waiting for my wife to finish. Finally, she came out and sat down across from me. Her hands were swollen and red. Her face and arms were splattered with blood. Her chest was heaving. We just stared at each other without saying anything. After a while, I asked her, "Is he dead?" She looked back at me and answered, "I fucking hope so." I nodded. That was all there was to say about it. I understood how she felt perfectly. I felt the same way. I didn't know what to do. So we just sat there waiting silently. Eventually my wife started crying and went to go take a shower. I just stayed there holding our daughter. And after a long while, I heard moaning and sobbing coming from the room. It turned out that my son wasn't dead. I went in to see how bad it was, and it was pretty bad. I've never seen a more merciless beating in my life. He was lying on the floor, rolling around with blood leaking out of his face. His nose was squashed flat. Both of his eyes were completely swollen shut and started to blacken already. I could see a couple of his fingers were bent in weird angles, and he had also pissed his pants. I think he must have been missing some teeth, but I didn't see any on the floor, and I couldn't see the inside of his mouth either. His lips were all puffed up and swollen. From talking to my wife about it later, I know that she had systematically beaten every part of his body, focusing heavily on his lungs. She told me that she kicked him in the groin repeatedly until his legs got tired, and kept beating his body long after he passed out. When my wife came out of the shower, I still didn't know what to do about our son. I didn't know whether to call the police or an ambulance, or take him to the hospital myself. I honestly had no idea what to do. After a while, I realized that I simply didn't care what happened to him anymore, and we decided just to let him live or die on his own. There was an in-law suite in the basement that we had never really used. My wife, my daughter, and I just moved down there. We simply ceded the top floor of the house to my son and locked everything down, separating our lives entirely. There was plenty of food in the upstairs cabinets, enough for a couple of weeks or more. We had a washroom in the basement, a small kitchenette, and a separate entrance so we could just stop going upstairs. We decided that we were just done with him. I figured that we would just let his food run out and then see what happens. Over the next week, we could hear him moving around upstairs sometimes. I think he just spent most of his time lying in bed recovering. I went to work, watching on high alert in case he attacked me in the driveway, but he never did. My wife stayed home with our daughter. She was never out of her sight. One night, we heard him going ballistic, smashing and banging things all around the house. We didn't respond. He never tried to go downstairs or get near us again, though. I think he was afraid that my wife would finish the job on him. After 3 weeks down in the basement, we hadn't heard anything from above for a few days. I ventured upstairs to the main floor of the house. The place was demolished, and there was no sign of my son. He was gone. It took months to repair the damage that he had done. There was food and shit smeared all over the walls and broken glass on the floor. Big holes in the drywall. He had ripped the place apart. He tore up the linoleum in the corner of the kitchen and emptied the entire foam fire extinguisher into the living room. I just felt grateful that he didn't burn the house down. I'm still not sure why he didn't. As a kid, he wasn't shy about setting things on fire. After that, I lived in fear every day that he would come back, that he would ambush one of us out of the blue and try to kill us. We moved about 3 years later, and I finally stopped being afraid that he would show up again, as now he had no idea where we were. I finally felt safe. All of this happened a very long time ago. My son was born in the spring of 1971. My daughter was born in 1988. I am an old man now. I'll be 70 this year, and my wife passed away from cancer in 2016. My daughter is 34 years old now. I moved in with her and her husband after my wife passed. I have 2 granddaughters that are the joy of my life. I see a therapist a couple of times a month to talk about all of this. I don't know where my son is. The last time I saw him, he was lying on the floor, bleeding and broken. I haven't heard from him since he left, more than 30 years now, but I don't want to know. I carry a lot of guilt from that time, and a lot of conflicted emotions. I didn't beat him myself, but I allowed it to happen, and I thought he deserved it. I didn't try to kill him, but I would have been happy if he died. I will say that I do hope he was able to overcome his demons and go on to live a normal life somewhere. If he wasn't able to do that, if he stayed the way he was, then I truly do hope that someone out there killed him. And whichever way it went, I just hope he's still not out there hurting someone else. I am uncomfortable sharing certain details about my story, so I will be purposely vague. This story happened back when I was in middle school. Against my wishes, my mom enrolled me into an after-school program called ELP, which stands for Extended Learning Program. I already hated school, and being forced to stay there for an extra hour pissed me off. I would usually get out at 4, but with the program, I was there until 5. I did well in school and I didn't really need the extra time. My only guess is that my parents wanted me out of the house for another hour. My house was a short walk from the school, so I would usually be back by 5:20 at the latest. On the day in question, a huge storm passed through our town during the school day. When 5 o'clock rolled around, there was still an overcast in the sky, which made things darker than usual. As soon as I left the school grounds, I noticed this old station wagon moving slowly down the street toward me. Maybe it was just a confused grandmother of one of the students, unsure of where the drop-off was. I simply ignored it and continued on. It wasn't until I was a block down the road that I realized the vehicle was tailing me. I looked behind me to see something truly terrifying. Behind the wheel of the car was someone wearing a white mask with a creepy-ass smiley face on it. I should have taken off on foot, but instead I just stood there like an idiot as the car approached me. Soon, the wagon came to a stop next to me. I looked directly at the driver's creepy mask before a muffled voice spoke to me.
Hi.
I didn't respond.
Need a ride, kid?
I looked to the ground and shook my head. When I looked back, I was horrified to see that the driver was now pointing a gun at me. I took a few steps back. The driver then squeezed the trigger, and I heard a click.
Bang. You're dead.
The wagon then took off down the street. I stood there in total shock. Some jackass thought it was funny to point a gun at a 14-year-old kid. I ran home and immediately told my parents about what happened to me. The police were called. They ended up arresting the man a couple of hours later outside of a grocery store. Apparently, he suffered from schizophrenia and was off of his meds. The gun he pointed at me was real, but was not loaded. Needless to say, he was locked up indefinitely. The good news is that after that happened, my parents felt really guilty, and I never had to go to that stupid after-school program ever again. This happened back in the late 90s when I was around 9 years old. To give you some background information, I grew up in a cul-de-sac toward the back of my neighborhood. Our school was only a mile down the road. The only crimes I ever heard about was when high school athletes would prank their teammates by covering their cars with toilet paper and Cool Whip. So needless to say, our parents never really worried about our safety. I was sitting in my front yard, waiting for my friend to get home from soccer practice. I suddenly heard a female shriek from somewhere close by. I looked over to see my next-door neighbor Heather running as fast as she could down the street, crying hysterically. She flew past me and into her house before I could even ask her what was going on. I then looked back to where she came from. There was a white car slowly cruising down our street. The vehicle looked severely rusted and beaten down. The kind of thing that wouldn't look out of place in a junkyard. Through the tinted windows, I saw a shadowy figure in the driver's seat. The car's engine revved up as it sped off and disappeared. I didn't see the details of the driver's face. However, I did see that they were looking directly at me as they took off. Even at my young age, I knew a threat when I saw one. Once the initial shock wore off, I ran inside. I don't know why I didn't tell my parents about the incident. I just kept telling myself that it was none of my business. Maybe it was Heather's boyfriend and they got into a fight or something. If she really was in some kind of danger, I would leave it to her to tell someone about it. A few days later, I overheard my mom talking to her friend about a predator that was trying to lure kids into a white van in the subdivision next to ours. I remembered cutting into the conversation and saying, "Mom, do you know if it was really a white car? Because I saw Heather the other day running away from someone in a white car." They completely ignored me, saying that it was rude to interrupt their conversation, and I shouldn't be joking about such a serious thing. I honestly don't remember what happened after this. Again, this was many years ago. To this day, I believe that Heather was only mere seconds away from being kidnapped. I also don't recall if they ever apprehended the suspect. I can only hope that they were never successful. This happened in 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I was 21 years old at the time. Back in those days, I was a night owl who did a fair amount of drinking. I was in downtown Portland one night and decided to stop and grab a quick drink after spending the day with some friends of mine. When I entered the pub, I noticed a very attractive girl sitting at the far end of the bar. She was wearing a hoodie, had a short hairstyle, and a pierced lip. I couldn't help but stare at her like some kind of weirdo. At this time I was still going to college. On campus, I've encountered many attractive girls on a daily basis, but I had never been so stunned like this before. Since we were the only ones at the bar, I felt that my behavior was becoming noticeable. So I made my way to the nearest stool, sat down, and ordered a rum and coke. I thought about striking up a conversation with the girl, but the last time I hit on somebody at a bar, I ended up with a drink on my face, a story for another time. To make a long story short, I didn't have the energy to play 4D chess that night. I'm just gonna have a few drinks, walk back to my dorm, and call it a night.
You look like a deer caught in the headlights.
I looked over, and the girl was now standing next to me. I was shocked. The last thing I ever expected was for her to come over and start talking to me. I had to think quickly. Sorry about that.
There's no need to apologize. It happens all the time.
I bet.
You're funny. Do you mind if I join you?
Please, be my guest. The girl took a seat next to me. So, are you from around here?
Oh, no. Actually, I just arrived in town.
Oh, really? Well, welcome to Portland. It's not as bad as people make it out to be, I promise. I'm David, by the way.
Nice to meet you, David. I'm Sadie.
Sadie and I talked for a while. I found out that she was originally from New York and relocated here to work for a property management company and to escape an abusive relationship. After hearing her story, I offered to buy her a drink, and we continued our talk. After about an hour, I realized that I had drank way too much. Hey, Sadie, I have to get going. It's a long walk back to my place, and I think I'm a bit drunk.
Well, you could always stay at my place. It's not far from here.
Are you sure? I mean, we did just meet. She then leaned toward me and rested her hand on my thigh.
I'm sure.
The thought of scoring with this girl did sober me up. So I paid off my tab, and we left the bar at around 10:30. We then made our way to the small parking lot behind the building.
It's just over there.
Sadie then led me to a green Subaru parked at the far end of the lot. Upon seeing the vehicle and noticing the Vermont plates, I got a bad feeling. Didn't she say she was from New York? I felt like a mouse about to enter an obvious trap, and so I stopped. Sadie? Are you sure about this?
What's wrong, David?
I don't know, I just got this really bad feeling all of a sudden. I'm not trying to be funny or immature with this next part. I'm simply only relaying what happened. Sadie approached me and caressed my area.
Well, how do you feel now?
The strange feeling I had was quickly chased away and was replaced by something else. Okay then. She walked over to the passenger side door and held it open for me. Before I knew it, I was inside the car of a stranger that I had met an hour ago. After Sadie closed the door, she began to walk around to the other side. But she did so very slowly. It was bizarre, almost as if she was pretending to be a zombie or something. That strange feeling from earlier returned. I remembered trying to open the passenger door, only to find that it was locked from the outside. Sadie stopped outside of the driver's side door and just stared at me through the smudged window. The dark parking lot obscured her features, making her resemble a dark figure. She then waved at me, and I heard her say,
Have a nice trip, David.
Don't ask me how, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I placed my right hand over my throat as a wire fell in front of my face and was pulled tight. There was someone in the back seat. If I didn't bring up my right hand when I did, the wire would have been right on my jugular. I heard the assailant in the back seat grunting as they pulled the wire tighter. As we struggled, Sadie opened the driver's side door. I could see that she was angry at what she saw.
You idiots, you're fucking it up.
A male voice boomed from the back seat.
Move his fucking hand!
Between the creeped out feeling from earlier and the literal attempt on my life, I was 100% sober now. Sadie climbed into the seat and reached for my hand. In all the excitement, she must have not noticed that my left hand was completely free. As soon as she moved in, I clocked her right in the face, sending her backward.
What the fuck? You just hit my girlfriend.
I felt the wire around my throat loosen, and I immediately took the opportunity and threw it off of me, and tried the handle on the passenger side door again. To my surprise, it opened. Before I knew it, I was running down the street as fast as I could. I ended up at a nearby convenience store, where I called the police. I gave them a detailed description of Sadie and the Subaru she was driving. I pretty much spent the rest of that evening giving my statement and answering more questions. I wasn't dropped off at the dorms until after 3 a.m. There have since been a few follow-ups to my case. It was determined that the Subaru was reported stolen earlier that evening. Sadie was clearly a false name, and she used a fake ID at the bar. This was also likely a case of what is known as lust murder. Sadie and her accomplice tried to murder me to fulfill a sadistic sexual desire. This is only a theory, but it does seem to fit. The perpetrators are still at large to this day. I am extremely lucky to be alive right now. If I hadn't raised my hand when I did, I have no doubt that I would have been strangled to death. I'll tell you one thing. That is the last time I'll ever try to pick someone up at a bar. This happened when I was very young. Since this is technically still an active investigation, I will omit certain details from the story. For some context, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming. As a non-outdoorsy kind of guy, growing up in the cowboy state wasn't exactly exciting on any level. As a side note, I didn't really appreciate my home state when I was younger. When I was going through my rebellious stage, I moved to Chicago and went to school there for 3 years. After I finished my education, I moved to San Francisco, where I resided until 2016. By then, I had my fill of city life, and I hightailed it back to Wyoming. I now live in Cheyenne. In my hometown, there was virtually no crime in my area whatsoever. It was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked at night. The only thing that we kids had to contend with was boredom. However, there was one incident that shook the entire community, one that I happened to witness firsthand. The year was 1991. I was in elementary school at the time. Back then, the school that I went to was located between several small coal mining towns that didn't have schools of their own. Some of these communities were an hour away, and for whatever reason, the school didn't provide bus rides to students who lived in these remote areas. My mom didn't get off of work until 4, and it took her about 45 minutes to come pick me up from school. There was a playground located in the schoolyard, where students who were being picked up by their parents would hang out, unsupervised. On the day in question, me and another kid named Thomas were the only ones on the playground. When class let out that day, I noticed that there was an old pickup truck sitting in the parking lot ominously facing the playground. I thought nothing of it at the time. I didn't know Thomas very well, and we didn't really talk to each other. I remember that I was trying to do chin-ups on the monkey bars while he was sitting on the bench near the parking lot. I eventually got bored of the monkey bars and walked over to sit on the slide so I could get out of the sun for a while. Shortly after, I overheard Thomas talking to someone. No, I don't know you, and I'm not going with you." I was facing the opposite direction. The main playground area sat between the slide and the bench Thomas was sitting on. But when I looked over, I did make out a figure standing next to Thomas. The only thing I seem to recall about them is that they were wearing a pair of jeans. My memory gets a little fuzzy after this, which is disappointing because I pride myself on having a pretty good memory. The only thing I remember after noticing the mysterious person talking to Thomas was seeing the truck speeding out of the parking lot and then realizing that Thomas was gone. I didn't see Thomas getting into the truck. I didn't even realize that Thomas had been kidnapped until the day after. My mom arrived about 10 minutes later. The next day I was called into the principal's office and was asked by a police officer if I had seen Thomas the day before. I told him about the strange truck in the parking lot and seeing someone talking to him while I was on the slide. Unfortunately, the story does not have a happy ending. Thomas's body was found in a ditch a week later in the neighboring state of North Dakota, which is less than an hour away from the school. This tragedy shook the entire community. A lot of parents blamed the school for not having someone out there watching us, which is a perfectly valid point in my opinion. After what happened to Thomas, not only did they have a chaperone out there watching us, but a police car was also stationed in the parking lot. It wasn't until I got older that I realized just how lucky I was not to be taken that day. I potentially came very close to meeting the same fate as Thomas. The scariest part of all this is that they were never able to find who abducted him or what their motive was. It just happened out of nowhere for seemingly no reason whatsoever. It's a scary thought to imagine someone just waking up one day and deciding to kidnap and murder an innocent child right out of the schoolyard. I don't think living in constant fear is healthy. However, be aware that evil lurks everywhere, even in some of the most remote, unassuming places. When I was a kid, my family would often frequent this Italian restaurant near the city's airport called Martino's. My great-uncle discovered this place during his quest to find a genuine Chicago-style hot dog outside of the Windy City. On the day in question, I went to Martino's with my dad and my uncle for lunch. I believe this was in the middle of my school's summer break, and my mom opted to stay home that day for whatever reason. After we were done, the three of us soon returned to my dad's car. My uncle got in the passenger seat and I climbed into the back. We hadn't gotten very far from the restaurant when we noticed an older pickup truck tailing us, driving very erratically. The truck kept accelerating, pulling right up to our rear bumper and then backing off, only to do it over again. Evidently, they were in a big hurry, trying to get my dad to go faster or to move out of their way. My old man isn't the type of guy who takes shit from anybody, except my mom. So he kept driving at the speed limit, refusing to move over. I thought the truck would eventually pass us. Instead, it got right on our bumper and stayed there. From the back seat, I couldn't quite see into the rearview mirror, but I remember my dad saying that the driver was so angry that he was banging on his steering wheel and screaming at us. The truck stayed behind us until we came to the next stoplight, which of course was red. As soon as we came to a stop, the driver's side door of the pickup truck flew open, and a younger guy stepped out. He was maybe in his late 20s to early 30s. My dad put his car into park and opened his door. Before the guy could even get a word out, my dad said very calmly, "You need to get back in your truck." For a second, the guy seemed taken off guard and looked as though he was about to back down. But then he took a step forward, staring my dad in the eyes. My uncle and I were both preparing for the worst when the stoplight suddenly flicked back to green. The guy sprinted back to his truck and tore off down the road. If my dad had been shaken, he didn't show it. My uncle and I were definitely on edge from the encounter, but we took comfort in knowing that we wouldn't see that truck again. Or so we thought. It was quite a ways up the road until we reached another intersection. We were in the right lane, and the truck was in the far left turn lane. Upon seeing it, my dad burst into laughter and made a wisecrack. "He was in a big hurry to go nowhere. Hey, watch this." As we came to a stop, my dad rolled down his window. "Hey, jackass!" When the driver looked towards us, my dad did a perfect imitation of him, banging on the steering wheel and shouting incoherently, the whole bit. That's when the driver lost his shit. The pickup truck backed up and came tearing out of the turn lane, barreling straight across the road, directly at us. My dad quickly turned down the intersecting road, the truck following behind, tailgating us again as my dad pushed the car to its limits. We were hauling ass, but the truck was quickly closing in. Just up the road there was an interstate ramp. My dad made a ballsy move. He waited until the very last second, and then quickly skidded our car into the ramp lane. As we climbed up the ramp, the last thing we heard was the truck's horn blaring as it disappeared out of sight. Thankfully, after that, we made it back home safely. When my mom saw how freaked out my uncle and I were, she pressured my dad into telling the story. I'm pretty certain she chewed him out right after, especially for his imitation gag. But as was typical, my dad was pleased with himself. We still talk about what happened that day every now and again, and we used to laugh about it, but now, even my dad doesn't crack jokes about it anymore. I think he finally understands just how deranged that man was, and the potential danger we were in. At any moment, things could have turned deadly. Back in the 90s, when my mother was in her 20s, she claimed that she was a bit of a party animal. Every Friday night, she and her friends would go to a popular club in Nova Scotia. For this story to make sense, I need to give you a basic layout of the club. There were 2 levels, one with a bar and dance floor. The second floor was a balcony that wrapped around the building. They were dancing at the club one Friday night when my mom got this uncomfortable feeling that she was being watched from somewhere on the balcony. She tried to see if maybe one of her friends was trying to get her attention, but she saw all 4 of them dancing on the floor. She then combed the balcony to see if she could spot someone staring at her, but with all the flashing lights and moving crowd, it was impossible to tell. So she brushed it off as a bout of paranoia. Later that night, she was doing shots with her friends when that same uncomfortable feeling came over her. Except this time, it was much stronger than before. She looked around the area again and saw no one, but something in her gut told her to stop drinking. She tried telling her friends, but by this point, they were all pretty wasted. They told her she was just being dramatic, and she should stop worrying so much and try to have some fun. This didn't feel right, so she grabbed the friend that was least drunk and pulled her aside to talk. We'll call her Chelsea. She explained to Chelsea what was bothering her, and to her surprise, Chelsea admitted that she had the same feeling, but didn't want to scare anyone. They both decided it was time to leave and dragged the rest of their intoxicated friends out of there. The next morning, her Aunt Carol, who lived in the apartment above hers, called her to show her a breaking news story. A woman had been found murdered in the alley just outside the club. She looked almost exactly like my mom. Same hair, same outfit, everything. They believe that she had been murdered about an hour after my mom left the club that night. As far as we know, the killer has never been caught. To this day, my mom believes that she was the killer's original target, and had she not left when she did, it would have been her on the news that day. She never went back to that club ever again, and I believe it shut down a few years later. Before the story begins, I want to point out that I don't live in Canada. I was just visiting when this occurred. I took a trip to Toronto to watch my home baseball team, the Seattle Mariners, take on the Blue Jays in the wild card. I'm happy to say that we won, but after the game is where things took a turn for the worst. I left the stadium with some friends of mine, and we wanted to head back to the hotel. The streets were crowded with people, and my friends and I struggled to get past the maze of pedestrians to get to the parking garage. We finally managed to reach our destination. We made our way to where the car was parked. It was towards the back section, which didn't have as many vehicles, and it was dimly lit by only a few lights hanging from the concrete ceiling. Suddenly one of my friends, let's call him Jack, tugged on my shoulder. "Dude, I think someone is watching us." I froze, and that's when I saw something just up ahead. There was a figure hiding behind a truck. The person was obviously not doing a very good job at concealing themselves. The second we saw them, they stood up. It was a very tall man, maybe 6'4", bulky, and wearing old clothes. He had a thick beard and messy, unkempt hair. He was one of those types who looked like they lived on the streets, but his size was intimidating. This man could do some real damage if he flew into a rage. The behemoth stepped out from behind the truck and began to charge at us. My heart sank, and I was terrified.
Holy shit! Run!
The three of us booked it to the car. I fumbled with the keys before I managed to open the door. The second everyone piled in, I immediately locked up the car. No less than a second later, I heard the sound of groaning metal. I looked over to see the bearded giant trying to get in. He wasn't just tugging on the door handle. It sounded like he was attempting to separate the door entirely from the car's frame. I didn't want to think about what would happen to us if he managed to get inside. I floored it, knocking the man over in the process. I quickly pivoted the car and hauled ass out of there. I remember looking into the rearview mirror to see the man standing back up and staring at us until we were out of sight. From now on, I'm going to be a lot more careful with my surroundings, and perhaps not park in the very back of a poorly lit parking garage, especially in Canada. You never know who could be hiding in the shadows, watching you.
There's always a reason to be afraid.